Chapter 17, The South and the West Transformed, 1865 to 1900. These are the core objectives for the chapter. Please make sure that you review them as you're reading the chapter. After the Civil War, we began to see a transformation of the South. While agriculture will still remain the primary occupation of most people in the South, there is a development of some new industries. Textiles becomes a major industry, as well as tobacco. And actually, tobacco becomes a huge industry for the South during this time period. We will see the South slowly beginning to transform from a solely agricultural society to at least a partial industrial society after the Civil War. As we discussed earlier in Chapter 15, agriculture will still remain the primary occupation of Southerners, and cotton will still be the primary crop. This means that the South still is going to be in heavy poverty after the Civil War, especially beginning in the 1880s as prices for cotton will drop drastically because of overproduction of the crop. Because of the lack of money in the South, we see that sharecropping and crop lien system being the prevalent way that crops are produced in the South. And remember, as we talked in Chapter 15, sharecropping was a means of the landowners having tenant farmers that work the land for them in exchange for a portion of the crop. The problem with the sharecropping system, though, remember, was that the sharecropper or the tenant farmer usually worked for less than 50% of the crop, and he still had to pay all of the expenses for producing the crop. So it usually produced a cycle of poverty for these workers in the South. This map shows us the number of sharecropping and tenant farmers as it relates to the various states. And you can see in the darker green states, you have over 50% of the population being either sharecroppers or tenant farmers. That is many of your old Deep South states, your Confederate states. The lighter green areas have 40 to 55% of their populations being sharecroppers. So you can see that includes some of your other southern states like Texas and Arkansas. And so as you go up and you see the lighter colors, you see that fewer and fewer of those states have sharecroppers, or at least fewer, a smaller percentage of their population is sharecroppers. But we will see that sharecropping is something that is done throughout the United States, but it is still predominantly done in the southern states. Race relations disintegrated in the South after the Civil War, especially after Reconstruction was over. Really, especially after we begin to see some of those Supreme Court rulings that limited the enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Beginning in the 1890s, we have a concerted effort on the part of many of the southern states to disenfranchise African Americans, to prevent them from voting, to prevent the enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments. This becomes known in history as the Mississippi Plan. The Mississippi Plan is a series of state constitutional amendments in the 1890s that limit the rights of African Americans to vote. This is when we begin to see things like poll taxes, literacy tests, any type of method that would prevent African Americans from exercising their 15th Amendment rights. After the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, we also see the spread of racial segregation in the South, the Jim Crow laws, which made it illegal for blacks and whites to attend schools together, for them to be treated in the same hospitals, to share water fountains, to get married. All of those laws for which, if you violated those segregation laws, you could actually go to jail. Also, after the Civil War, we begin to see a migration of Americans westward, beginning to occupy those lands that had been won, if you would, in the Mexican-American War from Mexico. This migration westward is going to populate the West with a very diverse population. Southerners who were trying to make a better life for themselves after the loss in the Civil War, Northern Americans who wanted to make a better life for themselves, immigrants from other countries who came to America that were hoping to have better lives will also spend some of their money to move westward, because there's this vast amount of land that's open for occupation, and the government is going to have very lenient policies that allow people to buy a lot of this land. Another group that begins to move west during this time period are African Americans, especially former slaves, who saw the West as a land of opportunity for them. This African American migration is sometimes referred to as exodusters, where the former slaves will exit the South and move out west and begin to build communities out west that are African American communities, where they will not be mistreated as they were in the North and the Southern states. The picture on the slide shows you an area in the West called Nicodemus. It's in Kansas, and it is actually a black community that was built during this time period. Unfortunately, many of the African Americans had a hard time out west, not because of discrimination, but because they were unprepared for the harsh living conditions there. Even though many of them had been farmers in the South, the land conditions out in Kansas and other Western territories were much different, and so many of the skills that they had in the South, farming, will not work in those areas. White farmers in the West are going to have these same problems. As Americans moved out west, we began to see new industries growing. The cattle industry had been very limited before the Civil War, primarily because there was no way of getting the cattle to market. And after the Civil War, with the advent of the railroad building, we see that the cattle industry becomes a big business, not limited to just those western and rural areas where it had been limited before. And so we see huge land barons developing huge ranches out in these western territories. Now the railroads can be used to get the cattle to market. So we begin to see things like the Chisholm Trail that are developed, where the ranchers will take their cattle on what they call the long drive along like the Chisholm Trail and other trails up to major cities like Kansas City, where then the cattle will be boarded onto trains, and then from those trains, then they will be landed in areas like Chicago, where then they will go into meat packing plants, and then from Chicago, then the meat can be distributed throughout the country. The stockyards that are developed along these areas produced a lot of jobs for people. We see some of our major Midwestern towns beginning to develop because of the cattle industry, as we mentioned just a minute ago: Kansas City, Abilene, Kansas, and of course Chicago. Chicago became the meat packing king of the country. Most of the meat from the cattle, as well as hogs, will be eventually get to Chicago and be developed by these big meat packing companies. Some of the biggest meat packing companies that developed during this time period were the Swifts and the Armours, and these of course are names that sometimes you see in the grocery store today if you're looking at packaged meat, canned meat, those types of things. In the beginning, the ranches were mostly privately owned. by individual farmers or by families. And as the meat industry became a bigger and bigger industry, these ranchers bought more and more land, and the ranches began to spread further north and further west, and they became huge enterprises. But by the late 1800s, especially by the turn of the century, many of these family-owned ranches were now corporate-owned ranches. Many of the ranchers had just overextended themselves, or when prices for the meat went down, they could not hold on to the land. The corporate ranches are going to change the whole landscape of ranching for the cowboys, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Ranching was a difficult business. It's really a boom and bust business. The ranchers encounter droughts. So once you have a drought, how do you keep your cattle watered? How do you keep them alive during these horrible blizzards that you have out west? How do you keep them fed when you're having a drought and the grass isn't growing, and we're having problems with overgrazing of land and having too many cattle? And so these are some of the problems that cause the individual ranchers to collapse and allow the corporate ranchers to take over. Of course, a major element of ranchers are the cowboys. And one thing we don't think about sometimes is who these cowboys actually were. What was the population? A huge number of them were actually Southerners. That's not surprising for us who live in Texas, but other Southerners that moved from other parts of the South and moved up into Kansas and some of those other western areas, took their knowledge of land and cattle, and many of them were actually Southerners. It is estimated that about 25% of the cowboys were actually African Americans. That may be surprising to some people because we don't think so much of black cowboys, but that is a huge percentage of who these were. And we do have elements today where people are trying to revive that legacy, and there's a black rodeo that highlights the black cowboys. The cowboys were, regardless of their ethnic background, they were seasonal workers. There are times when you need lots of cowboys to round up the cattle and to work them on the long drives. But when those weren't going on, you did not need so many of them, and so they were laid off. And so it is a difficult life being a cowboy. It is not romantic like it is in the movies. There were foreign influences for our cowboys, especially Mexican influences. We actually borrowed a lot of the tools, like the boots and the chaps and the traditional Western saddle. All were things that the Mexican cowboys had used, and American cowboys picked those up. Techniques for roping and the roundups were also taught to American cowboys by the Mexican vaqueros, the Mexican cowboys. So there are foreign influences into this very American idea of the cowboy. As we were saying, by the time we get to the turn of the century, we have moved from private ranching really to corporate ranching. For the cowboys, this had good and bad elements. It meant more stable employment for them. There's less laying off. The corporations usually could find jobs for them to do throughout the year so that they're not laid off. But it also meant that they had less freedom, that less freedom to roam the open prairies. We do begin to see also with the advent of the corporate ranching that the cowboys actually began to create unions to try to get better working conditions for themselves. Another industry that grew up in the West was farming. There was a huge migration from the East to the West, as we discussed earlier. And one of the things that encouraged Western expansion was the Homestead Act of 1862, which Congress had passed while the South was out of Congress during the Civil War, because the Southern states had opposed the Homestead Act prior to the Civil War. The Homestead Act of 1862 was designed to get white settlement in the West so that in the minds of American politicians, we could make that Western territory more productive. Under the terms of the Homestead Act, an individual could obtain 160 acres of land. All they had to do was work the land for 5 years, make improvements to it, build a barn, build a house, cultivate the land. Those would be improvements that would be acceptable, and then pay a nominal fee of about $30 to register the land in their name. And for 5 years of work and $30, then individuals could get 160 acres of land. The railroad is going to have a huge influence in bringing these people out west, because now no longer do they have to make this long trek by wagon train. The railroads can bring them, and the railroads actually encourage people to move west because they had obtained a great deal of land in building the transcontinental railroads, and so they want people to populate the areas. There will be diverse ethnic groups that will come out west. Settlers from all over the United States, immigrants that had come to America from all over Europe will come out west, and so the population out west will be one of the most diverse populations in the United States. These farmers that came out west to take advantage of the Homestead Act, though, are going to encounter a huge number of problems. And one of the first big things that they encountered was the fact that there was a lack of water. When the Homestead Act gave farmers 160 acres of land, they were basing that on the productive middle-class farms in the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley. And 160 acres would be a good amount of land. But in the more dry, drought-prone areas of the West, 160 acres was not really enough land to make a good living on. The lack of water, you can see the background picture shows droughts and the cracks in the land. Without water, it's difficult to grow crops, and so they're going to have to try to develop means of getting water to the crops. Another problem that these homesteaders experienced was fraud. Individuals, especially big businessmen, who came in and swindled them out of their 160 acres that they had. And so many of them will lose their lands soon after they gain those lands. They have to deal with extreme weather. It gets very, very cold in some of these areas in the winter and very, very hot in the summer. And so these extreme weather patterns made it difficult to grow crops, and we're going to have to develop new strains of wheat and different crops that will grow better in the West than had grown in the eastern United States. The soil is very different. It is not that dark, loose soil, loamy soil that grew crops so well along the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. It's more of a sod. It's harder to break up. It's harder to use. And so these are some of the major problems that the farmers will have to try to overcome in order to make a life for themselves out west. Some of the things that farmers did to overcome some of these problems were to develop new inventions to improve farming out west. And one of the first big ones was barbed wire. Joseph Glidden invented barbed wire. And barbed wire came about because many of the farmers got into altercations with the ranchers. The ranchers in the beginning believed in what they called open ranching. And the ranch lands weren't fenced in, and the cattle just roamed wherever and grazed. Well, that's all well and good unless you're a farmer and the cattle start to graze on your crops and trample down your crops. And so Joseph Glidden invented this barbed wire to fence in the farms and keep the cattle out. Another thing that they had to develop in order to make a go of it were stronger plows. James Oliver developed a steel plow that would break up that very difficult soil of the West, and then they are able to begin to really plow the soil and make a go of it. Some other things that make farming more profitable in the West were the grain drills. This is simply a tool that you can attach at first to the back of maybe a mule. Later, when you get tractors like the one in the picture, these early forms of tractors, you would connect this grain drill where it would mechanically dig a hole and plant the seed in the ground. Before this, all of these things had to be done by hand. Threshing machines that help to cut the wheat. Wheat is a major crop in these western territories. Threshing machines to cut the wheat and separate the wheat from the chaff. And then, of course, like I just mentioned, these early forms of tractors, because you're farming much larger portions of land to get the same amount of crops, and so you needed faster means of drilling and cutting your crops than just using manual labor like they had been using prior to the development of tractors. Mining, of course, is one of the industries that we greatly associate with the West. It is what brought many Americans out west to begin with. Of course, the first major gold rush was in California in 1849, before the Civil War. Then right before the Civil War in 1859, we have two other major gold rushes. One is in Colorado and the other is in Nevada with the Comstock lode. The Comstock lode in Nevada was not just a gold strike, it was also a gold and silver strike, and it was actually the largest monetary-wise gold and silver strike ever in the United States. A few years after the Civil War, in 1874, gold was discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and that, of course, is going to have some negative ramifications for Native Americans, because that's where the Sioux Indians had their reservation. The mining camps that grew up around these gold strikes emerged very quickly. They emerged simply because gold was discovered. Mostly what we see in these mining towns and these mining camps is a male-dominated society, very few women, because the miners are there just to mine the gold. And this is when we'll see that some of our ghost towns develop. You have a gold strike or a silver strike, people move in, they mine that area, and once the gold and silver is gone, they just pack up and leave, and that's why we get all of these ghost towns out west. We also see in these mining towns what we call a saloon society. There were usually more saloons than anything else, more saloons than churches or schools. This is where people went to relax, to get their news, to visit with their neighbors. There was usually very little, if any, organized law enforcement. It was a society of vigilante justice, collective violence. They took care of their own problems without any law enforcement until much later in the period. And we do see a lot of racism in these mining towns. There was a great deal of discrimination against Asians, especially the Chinese who moved to these areas because, of course, they were already in California, and so some of them try to get in on the mining, and they will experience a great deal of racism. Like farming and ranching, mining usually started out as an individual endeavor, but it usually ended up as a corporate endeavor. Especially with mining, as we see, once the loose surface gold is mined up, it takes heavy equipment to get deeper into those gold and silver shafts, and so that takes money for them to get into those shafts. We see here some pictures on this slide of miners in one of these shafts. They would go deep into these hills and work in the dark with, just lanterns to light their way to manually extract this gold and silver. And then the top picture shows us one of these mining towns that you can see. Mining brought so many people out west that several new states came into the Union as a product really of mining. Nevada, North Dakota, Idaho, and Wyoming all came into to the Union as new states because of the mining populations there. Well, the migration west was not good for one section of the American population, and that was the Native Americans. Prior to the Civil War, many Americans looked at the Great Plains as the Great American Desert, and so they were pretty happy to let the Indians have it, and they weren't interested in it at all. But after the Civil War, we began to see that with the Western expansion and the realization that the Great Plains, while it was different from the Eastern Territories, it was not just a desert. There was money to be made out west. We see more and more Americans moving out west, and that means they are going to begin to covet the Indian land. For decades, really, since the Indian Removal Act in the 1830s, the Indians have been given various territories in the United States to live on, the first one being in what today we consider Oklahoma, and then they have been moved to various other territories. We had created the Bureau of Indian Affairs to help us create a Indian policy, a way of dealing with Native Americans, and it was part of the Secretary of the Interior. And one of the first things that the Bureau of Indian Affairs did in the 1850s is it developed the first official Indian policy of the United States, known as concentration. Under the concentration policy, Native American tribes were given large tracts of land to live on. The land was large enough that they could still pretty much continue their traditional way of life, hunting the buffalo, being somewhat nomadic as long as they stayed in these large areas of land. And prior to the Civil War, the concentration policy worked pretty well because there was limited white settlement in the West. But after the white settlement began to grow, many settlers began to look at these Indian lands and want them. They would look over there and say, that would be good farming land, or that would be good land to ranch on, and the Indians aren't using it. They're not using it very well, and they're just wasting the land. And so the next policy that the federal government developed officially was the reservation policy. Now, the reservation policy greatly restricted the amount of land that Native Americans were given to live on. Now we see very small tracts of lands that the Indians are relegated to. And they will have, once the native tribe signs a treaty agreeing to go onto the reservation, they have to stay on the reservation. They cannot leave the reservation without permission from the Indian agent that's running that reservation. The Indians were promised that if they would move on to these reservations, that the government would take care of them, that they would provide for all their needs. They would not have to be nomadic. They would not have to hunt the buffalo, and the government would take care of them. Of course, the thing we do know in history is the government did not keep those promises. The natives suffered usually very greatly on the reservations. There was never adequate food or supplies for them. There was corruption. Often they were greatly mistreated. Some of these Indian agents would outright steal the goods that were supposed to come to the natives and sell those on the black market. Some of the Indian agents would withhold food from the natives until they became Christians. So the reservation policy was one that was very brutal for the Native American tribes. Many of the Native American tribes resisted movement to the reservations, and this Indian resistance resulted in what is sometimes referred to as the Indian Wars in American history. The Indian Wars last for about 20 years, beginning in the 1870s and going to about 1890. It's not constant warfare, and it's not warfare with one individual tribe through the whole time. We use it as a blanket expression because it covers the various conflicts with many of the different tribes out west. Usually when we think of the Indian Wars and the American interaction with the Indians, we kind of get our ideas of this from those old John Wayne Westerns. And it looks like the Indians are always on the warpath attacking the white man. Oftentimes, these attacks were done out of self-preservation because the white man was taking more of their land. But also, we usually kind of think of the brutality, the slaughtering of the white settlers by the Indians. But this was something that was commonly done by both sides. A great instance of white brutality toward the Indians was the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, where a whole tribe of Indians who felt that they had been granted immunity were just wiped out, men, women, and children, by an American cavalry unit. They were just slaughtered, even after they were told that, you know, if they surrendered, they would be okay. Some of the Indian wars were very organized resistance because many of these Native American tribes were very skilled fighters. They had swift ponies. They had guns that they got usually from corrupt Indian agents from Indian reservations. Perhaps probably the best known of all of the Indian wars was the Sioux War. The Sioux War lasted from 1876 to 1877, and it was a result of gold being found on Sioux land in the Black Hills. The Sioux had been given this land and promised that white settlement would not occur in that area. But once gold was discovered in that area, white settlers began to flock into the region. And so the Sioux will, quote, go on the warpath to protect their lands. The two leaders of the Sioux during this time were Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and they actually will join up with the Cheyenne Indians. And this is a coordinated effort on the part of these tribes to prevent the white man from taking over their land. The Sioux War is probably very famous because of one of the major battles in that war, and that is the Battle of Little Bighorn, in which General George Armstrong Custer will be defeated by the Sioux at the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Little Bighorn River in Montana. Custer, who had made a great name for himself during the Civil War, but had lost some rank and had some issues in the peacetime war, was trying to make him a name for himself again, fighting the Indians out west. And during the pursuit of the Sioux in 1876, he divided his troops, and he took a small battalion of about 250, 260 soldiers out ahead of the rest of his troop to track down the Sioux. And he came across this large group of Sioux at the Little Bighorn River. He thought it was mostly women and children. He didn't realize that there was a huge contingent of warriors a little further back, and so he attacked this area. And when he did, there actually ended up being about 2,500 Sioux warriors in that area, and Custer and his men were cut down almost to the very last man. And so the Battle of Little Bighorn was a great victory for the Sioux and Cheyenne. However, it was a limited victory because after this, of course, it got a lot of publicity in the newspapers, and the Indians were depicted as being brutal in their defeat of the American soldiers, and more soldiers were brought out, and eventually the Sioux were forced to surrender in 1877, just simply because they could not keep up within the amount of American cavalry that were being brought out by the railroads. Another group that resisted movement to the reservation was the Nez Perce of Idaho. Their story is very similar to the Sioux. They were given lands to live on, then gold was discovered, and so the white man began to infiltrate their lands. And so Chief Joseph was the leader of these Native Americans, and he led the Nez Perce on a trek of about 1,300 miles, fighting the American cavalry that was sent to track them down before he was eventually forced to surrender. Excuse me. Basically, what really begins to happen with both the Sioux and the Nez Perce, and then later the Apache, is they're just simply outnumbered by the huge numbers of cavalry that can be brought in by the railroads, the huge amount of horses and weapons that can be brought in by the railroads. And so the numbers of the Native Americans just keep dwindling and dwindling. And even if they wanted to continue to fight, they just simply don't have the numbers to fight. One of the last groups to surrender to the Americans were the Apache, the fierce Apache Indians of Arizona and New Mexico. And their probably most famous leader was Geronimo. Geronimo was actually able to hold out until about the mid-1880s before he is forced to surrender for the same reasons that we discussed earlier. When Geronimo surrendered finally in the 1880s, he was promised that the Apache would be placed on a reservation in New Mexico, because that was one of the big things, is they wanted to stay close to their homelands. And so the American government promised that they would be placed on a reservation in New Mexico. But of course, the government lied, and instead of putting them on a reservation in New Mexico, they moved them to Oklahoma. One of the interesting things about the Apache story is, though, while they were one of the last tribes to surrender, and they were considered to be one of the most feared fighting groups of the Native Americans, they actually ended up surviving better on the reservations than many of the other tribes. They adjusted to reservation life. They became farmers. Geronimo even joined one of these Wild West shows with Wild Bill Hickok and some of those individuals, and became quite a famous figure in American cultural society during that time. By 1890, the Indian Wars were pretty much over, and most of the native tribes had been subdued and rounded up and moved to the reservation. So what brought about this, quote, taming of the Indians? Well, some of the factors that really played a big role in the destruction of the Indian culture were the railroads. The railroads could bring out more and more white men and women, white settlers, more and more cavalry units, horses, weapons during the Indian Wars, and the railroads just tore up the traditional Indian lands, and so the railroads played a huge role in the ultimate destruction of Native American culture in America. White man's diseases also played a huge role, just like it had in colonial times when the first Native Americans came into contact with the Europeans. Things like smallpox and measles and chickenpox and things like this had a deadly influence on the Native Americans. Another huge thing that can never be discounted is the destruction of the buffalo. The Plains Indians lived on the buffalo. The buffalo provided them meat to eat. It provided them hides for housing and their clothing. They used the guts and the ligaments to make weapons. They used the bones to make tools. They used every part of the buffalo, even burning buffalo dung for fuel. And so when the buffalo were destroyed by these buffalo hunters that came out in the 1870s and 1880s, um, these buffalo hunters just destroyed huge entire populations of buffalo. The natives, of course, would hunt, and kill 1 or 2 buffalo just for that season, just to take care of their tribe. But these buffalo hunters would kill just entire herds of buffalo for their hides, and they would leave the meat to rot. It was estimated that these buffalo hunters killed off almost the entire buffalo population. By the time we get to the turn of the century, there was only estimated to be about 1,000 buffaloes left wandering in the wilds in America. So that they were on the virtual extinction of the buffalo in America. These sportsmen would, just hang out the windows of the railroad cars and shoot them, and they just shot them for fun. They shot them for their hides, and the result of that was the Native Americans did not have the food that they needed to eat. They did not have the means to produce the weapons and the tools that they needed to survive. And so the destruction of the buffalo is what encouraged many of the tribes to move on to the reservations. And so it plays a major role in the destruction of Native American culture. When the Native Americans were moved to the reservations, they were forced to become like the white man. It was a forced Americanization, if you would. They were forced to adopt Christianity. As I said in one of the earlier slides, some of these Indian agents would withhold food from the natives until they professed to be Christians. The tribal religions were made illegal. The natives could be imprisoned or physically punished if they were caught trying to practice their native religions. The children were taken away from their families and sent to white man's schools. They were forced to dress like the white children. The boys were made to cut their hair. The picture you see on the slide is at a Native American school, and you can see the boys have short hair. The girls have on all the same kind of dresses like the white girls would wear, and their hair's pulled back and, in a ponytail. And they were forced to learn English. They could not speak their native tongues. And of course, the result of this would be that it destroyed their tribal affiliations. They don't know about their tribal histories. They don't know their tribal religions and their tribal tongues. And so the reservation really undermined the entire culture of the Native Americans. By the early 1880s, by about 1885 or so, some Americans became concerned about the way we were treating Native Americans, and Helen Hunt Jackson wrote a book entitled A Century of Dishonor, in which she talked about how for 100 years since we had been a nation, we had abused the natives, we had broken treaties with them, we had lied, and her book became very widely read among the educated in the country and the politicians, and this book led to an Indian reform movement in America, which resulted in the Dawes Act of 1887. Now, when we look at the Dawes Act of 1887, for its time, it was considered Indian reform. In today's society, we would not consider it reform. The idea of the Dawes Act was the best thing that we could do for Native Americans is to bring them into traditional American society, to make them like good little white citizens and make them like us. It does not respect the culture of the Native Americans. So today, for that reason, we would not consider it reform. But for its time, it was considered better than the reservation policy, which was corrupt and abusive. Under the Dawes Act of 1887, there's a forced civilization on the Indians. what they did was they dissolved the tribe as a legal entity. They said tribes no longer exist as a legal body. That means that the tribe cannot make treaties on behalf of all of the people of the quote tribe. Uh, the chiefs don't have, you know, a certain power. They have no legal standing. You're just individuals. Additionally, the natives were set up in individual Indian households, just like, you know, the good white society household, mom, dad, and the kids. You no longer live as a tribe. You no longer live in this kind of communal living that most native tribes had been living in. Each individual Indian households would be given 160 acres of land, just like we saw under the Homestead Act. They were to live on the land, farm, behave like good little white citizens, you know, send their kids to school, go to church, farm their land. And then if they did that for 25 years, they would be given citizenship. Well, after 25 years, it was decided that the Native Americans still weren't ready for citizenship, and so they were denied citizenship. And actually, Native Americans were not granted citizenship in the United States until 1924. They are the last ethnic group that are granted citizenship. They have been denied citizenship until 1924 just because of their ethnicity. Of course, the legacy of the Dawes Act is pretty simple to see. It destroyed what was left of Indian culture from the reservations. And really that was its goal. It wanted the Native Americans to just integrate into traditional American society and become just like regular white citizens. And so we see a loss of the culture, a loss of the language, the religions, the stories, the history that was lost because of the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act policies stayed in force until 1934. In 1934, we had the Indian Reorganization Act, which is sometimes called the Indian New Deal because it comes about during the New Deal period of Franklin Roosevelt. Under the Indian Reorganization Act, Native Americans were granted religious freedom. That meant that they could go back to their traditional Indian religions if they desired. They don't have to, but they can. At least it's an option for them. They were once again granted tribal self-government, and so they could go back into the tribal form of living if they desired to do that. And they could go back to living on reservation lands that had been given to them. After the Dawes Act, we saw that because the lands were taken from the Indians and they were put up in these little individual households, a lot of tribal lands were sold. The Indian Reorganization Act stopped the sale of tribal lands and granted those back to the individual tribes. The people could go back to living in a tribal form if they wanted to. They don't have to, and many did not. Many stayed integrated into American society, traditional American society, but some did go back to living on the tribal lands. 1890 is considered what we call a watershed date in American history. It is the date that the U.S. Census declared that the American frontier was closed, that there was no more unsettled, unorganized territory in America. And so we use this date as the, quote, closing of the frontier. What this means really for America is it's kind of a psychological loss for Americans. We had always idealized the West. You kind of see from this picture on the slide, this romantic idea of the lone cowboy up there on the mountain looking out over the lands. And we had always looked to the West really as our safety valve, that when the East became overcrowded, we could always move west. We could always move west when we needed new economic endeavors. We could always move west when we needed new lands the famous newspaper editor of the 1800s, for Horace Greeley, said, "Move west, young men, move west." It was this, really just safety valve for us, for adventure, for economic endeavors, to prevent us from having overcrowding. And now the census has declared that the West is closed, the frontier is closed. There's no more of this unsettled lands out there. And we do feel this kind of psychological loss there because of that. However, it's interesting to note, as we will start chapter 19 here in a little bit, that 1890 is also the time that we really begin our foreign imperialism, when we begin looking outside of the United States to conquer other lands. So after we have conquered the American continent, now we will begin looking outside to conquer foreign lands in American imperialism when we get to chapter 19. And that concludes our chapter 17 PowerPoint. And our next chapter that we will be discussing is chapter 19.